Okay, let's see. I'm going to just wait a few minutes for people to get back in. I apologize for this. What a pain. I thought I was doing the right thing by upgrading my computer. Okay, looks like 9 of you are back. Let's just give a few more seconds for all 11 of you to get back. We are recording now, which is good. Everything else should be fine. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. I think we are ready to try sharing the screen again. I apologize to everybody for what happened. There we go. All right. Yeah, good. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the exam again. Sorry for the mix-up. Anyway, okay, so here's how it's going to work. You can take it at any 80-minute period between basically Friday at 12 a.m., 12:01 a.m., all the way through Sunday at midnight. So whatever is convenient for you. If you prefer not to take it on the weekend, you can take it Friday. If you prefer to have more time to study, you can take it Sunday. Whatever works for you best. It's take it on your own. You're taking it online. Just to remind you of the format of the exam. You have 80 minutes to take it. It is timed that way. There are going to be 60 questions on it. So it's over a minute a question. But as you know, as we've been going through the questions in class, that some questions actually do take sometimes longer than a minute. So you are not going to have time to look up every answer. Definitely not going to have time. Maybe a few answers here and there. And so what I need to emphasize now is that it's important you study. Last quarter, so the last quarter was the first time we ever did exams like this, online exams, where you took it through iLearn. We always used to do it in class, and people understood that they didn't have their notes available. Just because you have your notes available doesn't mean you don't have to study. Last quarter, we had a lot of problems. People on the midterm did not do well because they felt they didn't need to study. After they took the midterm, they realized that, yeah, you do need to study for the exam, and everyone did so much better on the final for that exact reason. So I beg you, please do study. You need to study. You are not going to have time to look up every answer. Just because it's open book does not mean that you don't need to study. Other than that, you must take it alone. I don't want anyone collaborating or anything like that. So it's important that you don't have any distractions or anything like that. And once the 80 minutes starts, you do have to finish it in that 80-minute period. Again, you have all your notes, everything available to you, your slides, whatever, the videos, which I don't think you're going to have time to scan through or anything during the exam. But you will have your notes and slides available. It will cover everything through taste. And today we're going to finish smell perception and start taste perception. We will certainly finish taste perception next class on Thursday and probably start getting into other material. I will let you know when we switch that on Thursday, when we start getting into the material that will be tested on the final. But we will have to use part of Thursday's class to cover the material on the midterm, everything through, including taste, which means that since you went through taste, I believe, on Wednesday's last discussion section, those will be the discussion sections that you will be responsible for studying for the exam. Yesterday, I believe you had something on touch and plasticity. I think you did the rubber hand illusion, as I remember correctly. Wednesday, you will be doing something on touch again. Those will not be tested on the midterm. Those will be discussion sections that will be tested on the final. So taste, remembering that taste is the last subject that will be tested on the exam. That should guide your studying for the lecture. For the discussion sections, which means through last Wednesday, and through the chapters in the book, which I'm pretty sure is chapter 5. I think chapter 5 is the taste chapter. Also, go through the preface, by the way. There's not a lot of content material, but there are a few things I'd like you to know in the preface, so make sure you do look through the preface of the book. And, as you know, there is stuff in the book that we didn't have time to either cover in lecture or cover in discussion, so it's important that you look at that as well. Tomorrow, Serena's going to do a little review for you. She's going to try out something we've never tried before, and that's one of those kind of, Jeopardy-style games or something like that, where she's going to ask you questions that will help you study for the exam. That being said, I do suggest strongly that you look through your notes before tomorrow's discussion section, if at all possible, to come in on Wednesday with your discussion section questions. I'm sorry, with any question from any of the material. Serena will be ready to answer any questions you have. She'll also go through a little review based on this kind of game she set up. Sounds like it's going to be fun. But if you do have questions, she's going to be there to answer questions tomorrow as well. Okay, let me stop here for a second and see if you folks have any questions about the nature of the exam, the nature of the material, what's going to be covered, anything like that. So I will stop sharing and see if people have questions. So anybody have questions? I've opened chat here. Do you guys have any questions? Anything at all? Nothing? You hear me okay, right? Right? You're just, you're so comfortable with the material you don't have any questions right now. Yes. Oh, okay, great. Thank you for asking this, Chase. Chase asks, what do you think is the best way for you to study the exam? What I would do, assuming, well, obviously you need to go through the lectures, whether it's the lecture live as you're here right now, Chase. What I would do is go through the lectures twice, if at all possible. So you're going through it right now, you're taking notes, but then you have the recordings available to you. So I would go through the recordings and then fill in your notes that way. And then go to the book and see what's in the chapters that I didn't cover. Okay, you'll be able to see, where the commonality is, but there are going to be some things in the book that I didn't have a chance to cover in lecture, or we didn't have a chance to discuss, cover in discussion. And then go through the discussion section material, which wasn't covered in either the book or lecture. So you should set it up, topic by topic, and then fill in things on that topic from the lecture. So, the first topic would be, hearing the silent world or hearing sound reflections. You should fill in everything having to do with that. That's from the lecture, from the book, and from discussion section. All that should go into your notes under that one topic. Okay? So that's an idea for how to study for the exam. Other questions on the exam? Other questions folks have? Okay, I think it's straightforward. You really have, well, you're going to, by the end of Thursday's material on taste, you're going to have probably almost 20 questions, of between 15 and 20 questions that we're doing in class. To help you practice. Those questions are on the exam. So you're going to have almost a third, maybe a little less than a third of the questions on the exam. That should help. And you'll have a very good sense of how I ask questions, so that should help as well. And if you study, you should do fine. It's just that you have to study. Last quarter, a lot of the students in the class were freshmen, and I think they thought that, well, if it's an open book exam, I don't need to study. I didn't need to do that in high school, so I don't need to do it here. You absolutely have to study. As long as you study, I think you'll do absolutely fine. I just want to make sure people don't fall into the trap they fell into last quarter. Of course, last quarter was a mess, as is this quarter, because of everything that's going on. And it's one of the reasons we're making the test doable at any time, not during class time or something like that. And I'm giving you so many questions, and I'm making an open book and all that sort of stuff. We're trying to make this, we want you to learn the material, but we don't want you to be overly stressed. We know what you folks are going through. Anything else about the exam, or should we continue with the material? Okay. Great, let's continue with the material then. Let me take off the silly cowboy outfit. There I am. Cool, okay. Some weird things happening on the computer because I switched. That's what I get for trying to be modern. Good. Let me go ahead and share the screen again. Good, make me big. Good. And remind us what we were talking about last class. We are on smell when I think smell is the bomb. So Be ready for lots of questions on smell on the exam, because I really think it's a great topic. And what we were talking about, we went through smell of, smelling, having a chance to smell T-shirts and being able to identify, individuals, including your family members and romantic partners, and then talked about the possible genetic basis of one's scent signature. Really interesting stuff, I think. But then we started getting into subliminal odor. We started talking about that in the context of things like having an odor pumped into a casino that is then no longer detected, and whether that truly has a coercive property. And we concluded probably not much more than any of the other decor sort of things. At the same time, we did suggest that your brain is always analyzing odors, even if we're not consciously aware. And sometimes those analyses of odors can have subtle effects. These, again, I want to be very careful here to not give you the idea that scent affects you in ways that other sorts of sensory channels don't. Again, your gambling is facilitated by the cool lights and cool sounds and all that stuff that's in the casino. It's just that with scent, after a while, you don't recognize it. You're not aware of it. There's no more coercion that goes on in scent. It's just that the channel becomes subliminal. It becomes something we don't notice anymore. And yeah, maybe it influences us to want to stay because the smell is pleasant at an unconscious level, but it's not coercing us. And then we talked about the fact that you can show the same sort of effects with, providing a cleaner smell in a room, and that can affect your, kind of awareness of clean-related topics in a word reading sort of experiment. Or if you're asked for the plans for the rest of the day, you might be more likely to say you're going to do some cleaning of your house, or maybe taking your car to the car wash. If in fact you have that subliminal odor in the room. And also, finally, we talked about the fact that if you're given a cookie at the end of the experiment, you're actually going to be a little bit more vigilant with cleaning up the cookie, cleaning up its crumbs. By the way, this does not work if the odor is very strong and it's very noticeable. It really only works if it's at a subliminal level, which is interesting, right? If you're very aware there's an odor in there, it's going to be distracting, and it's not going to have the same sort of effects, even though it's still there. It seems like for these effects, for these subtle effects to occur, the odor needs to be presented at a subliminal level. Okay, where else do we find subliminal influences of odor? Well, in your sleep, which is really interesting. I had no idea this was the case when I was writing the book. It's not until I went into the literature and realized that you actually do, smell in your sleep. So maybe you heard the old adage, wake up and smell the coffee. It's kind of a way of saying, face reality and see what's going on. But the idea of waking up and smelling the coffee is probably actually the opposite. You probably smell the coffee before you wake up, and it might actually, entice you to wake up, which is interesting. But there's a lot of research that suggests that you do actually process smells in your sleep. We've all had this sort of dream, I think, where we realize sound that's in the environment it can kind of integrate itself into the content of your sleep. So I think I've had this more than once where, I'd have a dream that would involve me stealing something, robbing something, being a jewel thief, and all of a sudden I set off the alarm, and in the dream I hear a loud buzzer, and I see lights going off, and maybe I hear police sirens coming, and then I'll wake up and I'll realize that what probably set that off was the buzzer of my alarm clock. The alarm clock's going off the buzzer, and that buzzer worked its way into the dream and maybe actually built the entire content of the dream. So it happened quickly while the buzzer was on. I think most of us have had that sort of experience. The same experience can happen with smells. So if somebody is in a dream state in a laboratory, and they know how to test this through measuring brain waves and eye movements and stuff like that, when a person hits the dream state and an odor is presented in the room at that time, that odor will likely integrate with the dream the person is having. So, say someone's dreaming in the lab, you pump in an odor of flowers, and let the dream kind of take its course. And then after the dream state seems to be over based on what you're looking at in brain waves and stuff, you gently wake the person up and say, what were you dreaming about? And very often they'll say, oh, I dreamt that I was running through a field of flowers, or I was giving flowers to my significant other or my mom or something like that. And that not only works with flowers, it works with cooking odors and things like that. So smells real smells in a person's sleeping environment will work their way into the content of dreams. Another thing I thought was really interesting when I was looking through the literature on this was how it actually can help consolidate memories. So you might know a little bit about this if you've taken an intro psychology class or a biology class where you've studied sleeping and dreaming, but we just have a very strong belief that one thing that sleeping and dreaming does is it helps consolidate the memories we've had throughout our day. So we know that it's a good idea. Here's a good suggestion for you for the exam. It's a good idea to study right up to the point where you're about to fall asleep, because having that material present in your brain before you start sleeping will then allow the natural sleep process to kind of consolidate those memories and make them more memorable for the next day, say when you take the exam. So we do know sleep does help with memories, whether they're memories for exams or memories just throughout your day. But you can actually use odor to kind of facilitate that. So if in fact you study with a subtle smell of flowers in the room as you're studying, if you then go to sleep and when you're sleeping and dreaming, the same odor is applied into the room, by an experimenter or something like that, the memories you'll have from studying under the same odor will be more consolidated, and you'll actually be able to retrieve those memories better. So the odor being presented while you were actually consciously studying and then represented while you were sleeping probably facilitated the content, the studied content come back and get consolidated through the dream process, so you then better remember it the next day, which I thought was really, really cool. That's a tricky thing to do. You're going to have, your parents or your significant other potentially, present the flower smell or something while you're dreaming. But, in theory, it would work. At the very least, it's not a bad idea to study right before you're going to sleep, even if odor isn't part of the process. Okay. Let's go on to some other really interesting things having to do with smell, and that's the idea of smelling fear. So it's long been known that insects, rodents, can use the smell of another animal's fear to guide their behavior. Okay, so for example, if cockroaches are sometimes used, ants are used, mice are used. Mice are fun. We'll use mice. If you're a mouse and kind of walking around a backyard or something like that, and you come upon an area where another mouse has been threatened, maybe injured, maybe just scared by a cat or a hawk or something like that, then by the fact that that other mouse released some odor, you will in fact detect that odor as a kind of wandering mouse and be scared yourself. Okay, so fear is kind of passed along between rodents and between ants and cockroaches. And we've known that for a long time. I think it also is true of deer and other mammals. They can kind of signal fear to each other. So if I'm that mouse that's just wandering around and I come upon an area where I smell the fear of another mouse, I get scared and run in the other direction. Now, I don't know what the consciousness of a mouse is. I don't know if I think to myself, oh my gosh, I smell that another animal has been threatened here, so I better get out of here. It might not be anything like that. It might just be all of a sudden they get scared and move away, right? But it does seem to facilitate their movement away from where another animal has been threatened. Does that work with people? Probably not, right? I mean, it's unlikely that you've all of a sudden got scared for absolutely no reason and have moved away from an area based on smell. But there's a very interesting way in which that kind of evolutionarily based behavior has been maintained for our own selves, for humans. Okay. I see there's questions. That's great. I'll get to them in just a second. I'm glad you're interested in this stuff. But let's talk about this research. Let's talk about this research on smell and how fear can be kind of transferred from one person to another. Here's what you do. Okay. You take people who are, say, on a roller coaster. It's often done with men's smells for some reason, and the men's smells presented to women, but I think it works more generally than that. But you take the smell of a man. He looks really scared, actually. Is that a man? He looks more scared than, looks like the gals are having fun. He looks pretty scared there. So he's on the roller coaster. He's done. You take a sweat sample from him, and then it's not going to be, body odor again. It's going to be his natural scent, more or less. But it's his natural scent in the context of being scared. And then you present it to people. Okay. By the way, another way you can do this is interesting. Some of the experiments are done by taking samples of people on roller coasters or other amusement park rides. Some of them are actually taken from people who are about to go into a lecture hall and take an exam. So especially if it's a very high stress exam, like your medical boards or something like that, you take sweat samples from these folks, and it works the same way. You take those samples and you go back to the laboratory and you present them to people at an undetectable level. So, if you basically take put it on a cotton, take the sweat, put it on a cotton ball, but then you present it to people in a laboratory setting, by piping it into the ventilation in the room, or maybe they're wearing some sort of cannula, the people in the laboratory, but it's undetectable. They don't know, the people who are receiving the smell now don't know that there is a sweat sample there. It doesn't smell like body odor. They just think that it's normal air coming through the cannula, say. Okay. And as they're getting that stress smell from a person, they're asked to perform a number of different tasks. Let me talk about the first task. The first task would be looking at images of faces. And the reason I put these up, it's not the best example of this. But what this is trying to show is you can set up a continuum of faces. Is this working? Nah, it's not very good. But imagine this. You set up a continuum of faces from happy to sad. I should get a better demonstration of this than those 9 images. But imagine that you have a person smiling and you have that same person frowning. They're not, exaggerated. It's normal smile, normal frown. And then what you do is you set up a continuum, meaning that you take the 2 images and you kind of blend them together. So as you go from smiling to frowning, you can set up in between images. So the one in the middle looks like it's, can be ambiguous. It looks like it's either smiling or frowning. And then as you go towards the smiling face, it looks more smiley. As you go towards the frowning face, it looks more frowny. Okay, so you have a continuum. This one's the most smiling, this one's the most frowning, and the ones in between, say there's 9 in between, go from smiling to frowning. And then you show these images one at a time in random order, and you ask people whether that picture is of somebody smiling and frowning. Okay, and people will say about half and half are smiley, half are frowny. Some of them are very ambiguous, but still. What you find is, this is the interesting part, if the subjects were getting that smell of a stressed person, undetectable by them, but they were still getting that smell, they will rate more of the pictures as frowny pictures than smiley pictures. In other words, getting that undetectable smell of somebody else's fear will make them interpret ambiguous pictures of expressions as more negative. Okay, that makes sense? Cool. Here's another thing that stress sweat does for people. Same type of method. People are in the experiment. They have a little nasal cannula. You know what that is? That's the thing that pumps a little bit of air through tubes. And they think it's just oxygen. They're probably told it's just oxygen. They don't have any conscious recognition of smell, but they are in fact getting the subtle subliminal smell of a person who has been stressed. Then this is what happens. Rather than expressions, we're going to do something else. We're going to induce a startle response. Oh, I've got a great example of a startle response. Can you hold on just a second? Talk amongst yourselves. Oh, shoot, I got to use this example, I think. Yeah, you'll like this. Okay, I'll be right back. Just take a second. I'm right here. Don't panic, anybody. Yeah, I know that was noisy, but it was well worth it, wasn't it? Yay. Okay. Here's what people hear. This has got to be one of the most annoying experiments ever, but it's pretty darn interesting, so it's worth it. So they're kind of sitting there, maybe doing a distraction task or something like that, and all of a sudden they hear this. Okay, you like that? That's cool, isn't it? Very cool. I can't remember what that instrument is called. It's got some Spanish name, I believe. Sometimes it's called a donkey jaw. It's a long story, but it's a great sound, isn't it? And what it makes people do is blink. It makes people blink like this. That's what it's showing here, okay? It's called the startle reflex. Everybody blinks if they're not expecting that sound. Maybe you blinked. I blink when I do it because it's so loud, right? That's a great sound. Everyone blinks. The question is, how much do they blink? How quickly do they blink? And you can measure that very easily these days by just using your camera on your computer. It can, do eye tracking. It can find your eyes, and it can determine how quickly your eyelids blink and what the amplitude of the eyelid blink is. So, is it a light blink or is it a heavy blink like that? And with this sound, which you're probably getting really tired of, it's usually a heavy blink. But what you can do is you can modulate how quick the blink happens, how large this startle reflex is by using the smell of somebody who's been scared. So, I'm sorry. This is part of the previous comment about it influences the subconscious, subliminal smell influences facial expression interpretation to be more negative, but it also amplifies the startle reflex. Okay, everyone blinks when they hear that nasty sound, right? Everyone blinks when they hear that nasty sound, but they'll blink faster and harder if in fact they're getting that subliminal smell of somebody else's fear. Okay? It does other things too, getting the subliminal smell of somebody else's fear. Very simple sort of task where people are just asked to say whether two words are related or unrelated. And what you find is people are more attentive in a task like that. So it actually enhances word tasks. So hat, cap are related, leg, cup are unrelated, related, unrelated, very simple task. You're faster at that and a little bit more accurate if you're getting the smell of somebody else's fear. So this is kind of interesting. It's a very subtle effect, so I don't think it's worth going out and finding somebody else whose fearful smell is near you, but it kind of makes you more alert and actually does a little bit of a enhancement of your performance on, a sort of task that involves matching, seeing if words match or don't match. Same sort of thing. So even though, we're not kind of, pushed to run away from a fearful smell or try to avoid a fearful smell or something like that, it looks like at least the evolutionary remnants of that sort of thing from, mice and deer and roaches and ants. That thing's still with us to some degree, where the subliminal smell of someone else's fear does have an effect on us. It's subtle, but it is an effect. It actually affects some people more than others. If, in fact, people are self-rated as anxious. I'm a little anxious. I don't know. A lot of scientists are, they can be a little anxious. Just it's part of the scientific neuroticism that helps us be careful scientists. It affects someone like me as much, a little bit more than other folks who wouldn't self-rate themselves as anxious. Okay? So for people who say, yeah, on a scale from 1 to 10, I'm probably a little bit more anxious than other people, they will show the subliminal effects more. They will show that their eye blink, that startle reflex, is faster and greater when they hear the sound, if in fact they are getting the smell. The subliminal smell affects them more. I don't think this next point's in the book, but I think you'll find this interesting. This also works if you sample a smell from somebody who is disgusted. Other things work, I should say. But if you take the smell not of somebody who's just been on a roller coaster or somebody who's going into an exam, but instead take the smell from somebody who's looking at a video of somebody who's doing something gross. They used to have this old show. God, what was that show called? I can remember there was a show where people would have to eat really gross things. It's kind of like a reality challenge show. You have to eat really gross things. And they used to be able to use videos of people eating like raw intestines or something like that from an animal. And then people would watch that, and you could take the smell of them watching it, and their reaction is certainly a disgust reaction, and present that subliminally to people, and people would then show responses, subtle responses of more easily being disgusted than they normally would. So the subliminal smell of fear can have subtle influences, and the subliminal smell of disgust can have other influences. And as I said, this is also going to be something that mimics odors in the animal world. Okay, so, well, look at this. Ants, mice, deer, I mentioned those, but amoeba, which have chemical detectors, all show the same thing. If an amoeba comes upon an area in a petri dish that where another amoeba has been threatened somehow or hurt somehow, it will in fact stay away from that location, just like ants, mice, and deer. So it does, the fact that we have reactions does mimic other animals. It's just that our reactions are different. We don't get up and run, okay? We don't avoid places, at least not knowingly. But we do show subtle reactions that can be, kind of observed in the laboratory from getting the subliminal smell of somebody who's been scared or somebody who has been disgusted. Okay, let's take a little break here, see what our questions are like, and then I will do a polling question as well. Okay. Oh, all right. Are you talking about pheromones? Okay, so that's a great question, Brittany. Thank you for asking that. Well, not yet. Well, I will be talking more formally about pheromones, but yes, in the animal world, these things are considered pheromones. They absolutely are. In the human world, there's a lot of controversy over pheromones, and so it's unclear whether they are pheromones they are typically defined. But I will unpack that kind of controversy in the next slide or the slide after that. So you're asking a great question. The answer for mice and amoeba and deer, yeah, they probably are pheromones. Certainly, they're considered pheromones in that context, but for us, it's more controversial. Kimberly asks, Fear Factor. That's right, Fear Factor. That's not on anymore, is it? Fear Factor, Kimberly? I don't think it's on anymore. My gosh, that was a weird show. There's a lot of weird reality TV, but I think that was especially weird. Not sure, it's pretty old though. I think they made it, yeah, they might have done a remake. I think that, you can see old videos, and I think didn't almost every episode involve people eating something really disgusting, and that would be one of the challenges. You know, they do other things like putting people in a coffin-sized box filled with snakes and stuff like that. That's good TV. All right. Any other questions about what we've been discussing? Great questions. Thank you so much for asking them. Let's do a polling question. All right, we can do one. Let's see here. Yeah, let's do this one. This one's simple. Okay, here we go. So one way to get someone to clean up a few more cookie crumbs, this should be easy for you, we just reviewed this today. One way to get someone to clean up a few more cookie crumbs is to A, present them with a strong, noticeable odor of cookies. B, present them with a weak, undetectable odor of cookies. C, present them with a strong, noticeable smell of cleaning fluid. Or D, present them with a weak, undetectable odor of cleaning fluid. I think you'll all get this one. All right, have you all answered? Let's see, 5, 6, 7, 8. Nope, not quite. Give you a few more seconds here, so it's a full minute. All right. Well, most of you did get this right. Let me display the answers, although not everybody, so we'll go through it in some detail to help you out. Just do this. There we go. All right. This is so weird. I'm going to share the results. Okay. So I'm not seeing it correctly. Hopefully you folks are, and you're taking a picture of it, but the answer is in fact D. For whatever reason right now, I am not seeing the D as the correct answer, but that's okay. I'm telling you the correct answer is D. You know, you upgrade your computer and you think, oh, it's working fine, and then little by little as the days go by, you find tiny little things that are messed up. Here's something else that's messed up. I am not seeing the correct answer, but hopefully you are. Okay, one way to get someone to clean up a few more cookies. The smell of cookies doesn't help. It's the smell of a cleanser that makes the difference. You know, you're smelling the cookie anyway, but that's not going to do it. It's the fact that it's a cleanser that kind of induces unconsciously the concept of clean, which is going to help you clean up the crumbs. It's going to kind of facilitate your thinking of clean things and maybe being a little cleaner when it comes to the cookie crumbs themselves. Importantly, as I said earlier today, it has to be at an undetectable level. If it's a very strong smell of the cleaner fluid, it really doesn't help. It has to be undetectable. So the correct answer is D. About half of you got that right. So yes, the answer is not A, B, or C, it is D. Okay, hopefully you can see this okay. I am not. All right, any questions on this question? Okay, I will stop sharing and hopefully it will work better next time. Yeah, it is not. Okay. Okay, any other questions before we continue with the material? All right, Brittany, good news for you. We are getting right into pheromones. I remember now. We do get right into it in this next slide. I think you'll find this really interesting. And if you read ahead in the book, you know that I had a chance to interview the woman who first reported pheromones, pheromone influences, possible pheromone influences in humans. Okay, so here's the deal. This has been a controversial topic for 50 years or so. the idea that pheromones, which we know exist for animals, might exist for people and actually have any influence over any of our behaviors whatsoever. It depends now on who you ask. I think a lot of kind of more traditional biologists don't think that there's pheromones that influence human behavior. But I think a lot of people who study it in humans, a lot of psychologists think that there is some evidence for some influence. But if you read the book, you know that one of the first discoveries where there might have been evidence shown for pheromones was done by Martha McClintock. And she was an undergraduate doing her senior thesis. Maybe your senior thesis could be as famous as hers if you're doing a senior thesis. And she was interested in biology and then ultimately psychology. She knew about pheromones from animals, from mice. She'd been studying it in a biology class. And she knew that mice showed this phenomenon of what's called menstrual entrainment, that if you took mice that had never cohabitated before, female mice that had never cohabitated, and measured when their menstrual cycles happened. And I can't remember what the deal is with mice, if it's once a month, or I think it's more frequent than that. But the cycles originally were not at all, entrained. That means that they were not at the same time during each cycle until they were put together in a cage. And if they're put together in a cage after, say they have a once a month cycle, after a month or so, their cycles kind of synced up. They synchronize so that the same week of the month, these mice now had their menstruation. Okay, this had long been known about mice. It had been known about other mammals as well. But no one had ever thought this was relevant to people, at least not on a scientific basis. However, if you talk to women, and Martha felt this way when she talked to people in her dorm, they realized this happened too. They said, "Oh, we have to, it's the same. It's the same time of the month. Everyone's, kind of going through menstruation now." And she was particularly aware of it because she was on a work study program, and she was the one that was responsible for going out to the drugstore to get needed supplies for her dorm, her dorm. And she realized that, it was usually once a month that everybody would need, sanitary products at the same time. And she realized that not only did this occur, but it occurred more as the year went on. So at first, people would need the sanitary products at different times of the month. But then after being in a dormitory together, for a month or so, they then seem to sync up. They then seem to entrain. By the way, this was done at Wellesley College, and that's an all-women's school. It's one of the few all-women's schools left from the Ivy sister schools, as they used to be called. Beautiful place. I taught there for a year. It's one of the prettiest universities I've ever seen. It's just outside of Boston. It's a beautiful, beautiful school. Anyway, she was there in an all-women's dorm and noticed that this entrainment seemed to work for people as well as it worked for mice. And she decided to make this her senior thesis by interviewing people about when their cycles occurred when they first got to the dorm, and then after being in the dorm for, I guess, 4 or 5 months. And she realized that, in fact, they did sync up. Okay? And she wondered, did this have to do with the same type of influence that was known to work for mice? Does this have to do with pheromones? And pheromones here are these kind of subliminal, I should say, odors that are kind of like a chemical messenger between animals or between people. They're kind of like, for mice, they'd be like chemical messengers that work through smell that kind of have subtle effects on metabolism and biology. Okay? Subliminal meaning that if they're working in humans, it's probably based on a smell that we are not conscious of. So can we say that pheromones do the menstrual entrainment, the menstrual syncing, that seems to be observable for humans, as we know it does for mice? So there are things you can do with mice where you take, take two female mice that aren't cohabitating. They're in different rooms completely, and their cycles are not synced up. and present the odor. You take a little, I don't know how you get an odor from a mouse, but however you do that, you take the odor from one mouse and give it to the other mouse and keep doing that throughout a couple of weeks, and then they will synchronize up. Okay, so it is known that mice synchronize their menstrual cycles based on pheromones. Is that also how people do it? Well, she speculated in this paper. She published her senior thesis in Nature, which back then is one of the kind of the most reputable scientific journals. She said, no, I don't have evidence that that's how it's done, that it's done through pheromones, but there's no reason to think it might not be done through pheromones, because that is how it works with mice and other rodents that have been tested. People were suspicious, though. People were suspicious that humans were driven by pheromones, and they really kind of criticized this work. They said, well, when people are basing their own judgments, if the data is based on people's own judgments of when their menstrual cycles are, they could be influenced. Their idea of when their menstrual cycle occurs could be influenced by who they're living with. It's one of the problems with self-reports. You have to trust people in being accurate at reporting when their cycle is, and their reports could be a little off and be influenced by the person they're living with, right? That could happen. And people say, yeah, you can't make any hard scientific conclusions based on self-reports. Okay, that's a valid criticism. The other thing that occurred, which is kind of interesting, I'm not sure if this aspect of it was ever followed up, but they found that the entrainment occurred more strongly for people who weren't necessarily living in the same room, but were good friends in the dorm. Okay, now that's an interesting phenomenon. So, very often this happens, right? When you first live in a dorm, you're friends with your roommate, but you might not have as much in common with them as you do somebody down the hall or somebody on another floor of your dorm building. That makes sense. That happens all the time. And you end up spending time with that person during the day, but you're sleeping in the same room with your roommate. And what she found was that people synced up more with their friends who they were spending a little less time with than their roommates who they were sleeping in the same room with at least 8 hours a day. That's a lot of time to spend with somebody. Why didn't they sync up more, the roommates? I'm not sure why that occurred, but it was another criticism. That wouldn't be an issue for mice, supposedly. So she followed up the experiment a number of years later with a very clever sort of design. I think you'll think this is pretty cool. What she did is she took sweat samples now from women that were ovulating and were in their pre-ovulation part of their cycle, so the week before they're ovulating. And you can test this in various ways. Back when my wife and I were trying to get pregnant, there's various ways of testing this, whether it's time for ovulation or not. Very often women can tell this because of, feelings and all that sort of thing. But if they can't, they can also take their temperature, and there's a whole bunch of things you can do. But they actually had chemical ways that they were taking samples so they could determine that. And they just took these samples. This wasn't a cohabitation experiment. They just took these samples from these women and then presented these samples to a group of other women. And they were presented in a very kind of sterile way. What they did is they presented them by taking little swabs of the ovulation and pre-ovulation sweat and applied it to this other group of women just on their upper lip. Okay, and they didn't even tell they didn't tell them what was going on. Sounds a little icky, I know, but it really isn't. In fact, what they did is they took the ovulation and pre-ovulation sweat and they put it in little vials of an alcohol solution and then swiped that on the upper lips of this new group of women. So when the new group of women had this put on their upper lips, they said, oh, I smell a little alcohol, but that's it. So they said, okay, thank you for doing this. Just don't wash it off for the next few hours. Just don't wash your face for the next few hours. They thought they had, a little alcohol solution on their lips, which just evaporated, and they didn't even smell the alcohol smell after a few minutes, probably. Okay. And then what they did is they had these women come back, half of which had gotten the ovulation sweat on their lips, and the other half of which had gotten the pre-ovulation sweat on their lips. And this they did this for a number of days. They gave that first group ovulation, the second group pre-ovulation sweat for a number of days, and then it tested how their menstrual cycles might have changed. Okay, and what they found was something pretty cool. They found that depending on if a woman got the ovulation sweat or pre-ovulation sweat, their menstrual cycles either sped up a few days or slowed down a few days. Okay, it wasn't a complete shift in the menstrual cycle, but it was a systematic shift. I guess if they got the pre-ovulation sweat, their menstrual cycles would speed up a couple of days. They come 2 or 3 days earlier than the previous months. If they got the ovulation sweat, their menstrual cycles would slow down a few days, slower than the previous month. And so that seems like a pretty systematic way of showing kind of the chemical secretions of one person that's in an odor can affect the menstrual cycle of another woman. Okay, I think that's pretty good evidence. I do, and I think a lot of psychologists do. There are still a lot of biologists that don't think this is a true pheromone influence, but boy, I mean, something is going on here chemically coming through the olfactory system that's having systematic effects on a woman's menstrual cycle. Not sure what else you would call that if you didn't call it pheromones. But I will tell you that there are some, I guess, valid reasons people are wondering how important, at least, or whether it's the same type of pheromone influence that you see in rodents. What we're talking about here, by the way, is a class of pheromones called primer pheromones. So what I'm going to do now is talk about different types of pheromones that are known first in animals and then shown for both humans and animals. But the most famous type of the famous type of pheromones that biologists talk about are primer pheromones. And these are the sort of scents, kind of chemical messengers that go through scents that do the entraining of mice for their menstrual cycle and entrain other animals for their menstrual cycle. They kind of prime the body to shift its metabolism a little bit, its biology a little bit, so menstrual cycles end up synchronizing. That's a primer type pheromone. But there's another type of pheromone that's often discussed by biologists, and it's one that we've actually discussed in the previous slide. And that is a pheromone that kind of releases a behavior, a more dramatic type of behavior. It seems like a more dramatic sort of influence, and that's called a releaser pheromone. It's kind of like the chemical message induces a reflex in an animal. And there's lots of examples of this. Let's talk about the ant scattering first, because we just talked about it. That would be an example where the ant is walking around a kitchen and all of a sudden comes upon an area where another ant has been afraid or hurt or something like that, and will all of a sudden just run for its little ant life. Okay, the same thing happens, as I said, with cockroaches and mice. If a mouse smells an area in your backyard where another mouse has been scared, it will almost reflexively run for its little mouse life. Okay, so those are examples then of releaser pheromones, in that this kind of chemical message of the scared mouse kind of releases a reflex in the mouse that's smelling that odor. Okay. Another one that you can see there is pig mating stance, and that's another classic example. They talk a lot about this on, with research on agriculture and farms and things like that. That if a female pig is in its, I guess, estrus, it's ready for making some piglets. If a male comes into its pen, it will spontaneously go into a mating stance. Okay, it will be ready for romance, I guess. It will seem very reflexive. You know, if you've ever worked on a farm, I haven't, I've never seen this, but I hear it seems reflexive that, you know, oh, okay, old Bessie is ready for making some piglets now. It's that time of the month for old Bessie. Let's bring in a male and help out the situation. And they put the male in the pen, and the idea is as soon as the male's in the pen, the female will say, ready for romance, and facilitate the procreation and all that stuff. It's long been thought that that would be another example of a releaser pheromone, because it's thought that the male pig's scent is detected by the female and kind of reflexively puts her into that stance. Okay? You get the idea? It's another example that where this chemical messenger, this pheromone, is releasing a behavior in the receiving animal, the animal that's smelling the odor, and it's putting it into a reflexive sort of behavior. Okay? All right, so those are studied. Those have long been studied in animals, all types of animals, and we know a lot about those sort of pheromone sort of behaviors. What about people? What about people? Do we seem to be affected in the same way? Do humans seem to be affected in the same way? Well, you know, we just talked about one. Do we have primer pheromones? Are any of our behaviors based on primer pheromones in any sense, right? Well, we talked about one, possibly. If Martha McClintock and her colleagues are correct, yeah, it looks like maybe there can be some menstrual entrainment based on pheromones in people. There does seem to be some evidence of that. So possibly we are sensitive to and to some degree guided by primer pheromones. Also, there's some evidence that being exposed to a man's pheromones, a man's smell, will regularize the menstrual cycle of women who have somewhat irregular menstrual cycles. So maybe you know somebody, maybe you yourself would have a cycle that would not quite be, you know, once a month, or you know, would come much earlier some months, much later some months, and then cohabitate with a man, maybe a romantic partner, you know, maybe a male housemate or something like that, and find that her cycle would then become more regular. And it's a known phenomenon in the same type of experiments that Martha McClintock had done with, you know, using odor on the lips have been done, you know, to see if male smells will regularize a female's menstrual cycle, and it looks like it does do that. So that might be another example of a primer pheromone influence in humans. The men can shift and regularize. And what I mean is make more regular, more kind of consistent a woman's cycle. But what about releaser? Okay, so even if we're willing to say that, yeah, maybe human behavior, human biology, metabolism is influenced a little bit by these primer pheromones, at least in the case of menstrual cycles, what about these releaser pheromones? Do we show any evidence for that sort of thing, right? So do we, when we smell, you know, the scent of a significant other, do we go into a mating stance, or do we run away for fear? Do we have any sort of reflexive reaction like a releaser pheromone is thought to induce? And the answer, I would say, for the most part, is probably not. You know, certainly we don't have something analogous to the pig stance, thank God, right? So a woman is ovulating and she smells a man nearby. No, you know, she's just as likely to ignore him as anything. It's not some sort of the reflexive behavior like the pig has, or you know, if we're scared, if we are exposed to the scent of somebody who is scared, we won't reflexively run away from where that scent is emanating. Right? It does have a, you know, kind of subtle influence, as we discussed in the last slide. It can make us more vigilant. It can make us interpret ambiguous facial expressions in a more negative way. But no, we don't reflexively run, you know, when we're exposed to somebody's fearful odor. So I don't know if releaser pheromones are some part of the human kind of repertoire like that. And I talked to Martha about this, and I knew a little bit about the literature, and she brought up a really good point that made sense to me when she presented it, which was this. Releaser and primer pheromones might make sense to talk about with regard to animals. But with regard to humans, we might need to talk about other classes of pheromones. Classes of pheromones that we might say have an effect, but maybe have more subtle effects than what we see in animals. More subtle than the releaser and primer pheromone classes. So her and her colleagues have suggested a couple of things here. One would be a signaler type pheromone. So we have two classes we've discussed before already, releaser, primer, mostly discussed with regard to animals, may be relevant to humans. And then Martha's saying, let's consider another couple of classes. One we'll call signaler. And that's going to be a pheromone, kind of one of these odors that are, probably working mostly at a subliminal level, that signals certain things about a person. It conveys information, say, about whether somebody is related to you genetically, whether somebody is male or female, which is something we can detect, whether somebody has the right sort of, genome to, create healthy offspring, the reproductive potential. Okay, and so she's saying, all that stuff that we've talked about, in the previous discussion of scent, all those T-shirt examples that we've talked about might be thought of as signaler pheromones. That, the fact that you can recognize kin, that you can recognize gender and your romantic partners, and whether someone's MHC is complementary to your own. Remember, that's good for your offspring. They're going to have healthy immune and autoimmune systems, right? Maybe all of those things can be considered like a chemical messenger that's not doing something to you reflexively or not changing your biology, so your menstrual cycle and trains, but does something else. It signals important information about another person. Okay? That's cool. It's a cool idea. So she's saying we need to consider more when it comes to humans. Could also be that animals are sensitive to these too, but haven't really been studied in that way yet. And she then said, here's another idea. Let's talk about not a sort of a primer that's going to change your metabolism, your biology, so your menstrual cycle changes, but something a little bit more subtle called a modulator type of pheromone. And what a modulator might do is actually have very subtle effects that aren't reflexive, but can change your mood and emotion just a tiny, tiny bit. It will modulate your body so your emotion is changed, your mood is changed. Maybe it will make you more vigilant. Maybe it will make you a little bit more startled, okay? And so what we're talking about here is what we talked about earlier, fear-inducing smells, okay? Smells that induce us to have a, a larger eye blink response when this happens. Okay. A fearful smells that will make us interpret facial expressions as a little bit more negative, make us more vigilant on tests, okay, that type of thing. That's not having a reflexive sort of effect on us. We're not running away when we get exposed to a subtle, fearful smell. It's affecting us in much more subtle ways. It's not releasing a behavior. It's having a subtle modulator effect on a behavior, okay? So let's talk about these two. Let's talk about these two categories. Let's talk about first signaler pheromone effects. What are some examples of this, signaler pheromone? Things that are telling us about other people. And I already mentioned one, MHC compatibility. Okay, remember this idea of the complementarity between the MHC structure. Remember, MHC is major histocompatibility complex. I can't believe I remembered that on my own. That's impressive. You remember it from the other day, but I don't care about the technical details. I care about the concepts. And what it suggests is that when that somebody's signature might be determined by this major histocompatibility complex, this MHC, that's also playing a role in determining the nature of somebody's immune system and autoimmune system. So that when you smell a t-shirt that you think is an attractive smell from a stranger, okay, that's a good smelling t-shirt from that guy. I don't know who it is, but out of all 10 t-shirts, that's a good one. Okay. The MHC is having an influence over the scent signature as well as playing a role in the autoimmune immune systems of that person. So if you're then attracted to that smell, you might potentially have a better chance of having offspring with that person, which is good because that attractive smell is signaling that they have an immune system that complements your own, that complements kind of the gaps in your own immune system. So, wow, this is a nice immune system. This is a nice immune system. But boy, when you put these together, they complete each other, right, to make babies that are ta-da, super healthy, right? So that's a good thing. You're attracted to smells of people who are going to help you produce healthy offspring, stronger offspring immunity in your little babies, okay? We know, in fact, this is true for mating in mice, birds, fish and lizards, and probably lots of other things too. What it suggests is that when you look at the MHC or whatever is comparable to MHC in these animals, you find that a mouse will mate with another mouse that has a complementary immune system. A male bird will mate with a female bird that has a complementary immune system. So in fact, their immune system complementarity does help guide their mating. It helps guide their mating. They will choose mates that do have complementary immune systems. Is this true in humans? The answer is it's not clear. What is clear is that a woman will like the smell of a man's t-shirt that has a complementary immune system. It's not clear if it really guides mate selection. Do couples that are married, in other words, have complementary immune systems? Not necessarily, suggesting that there's a lot that goes into choosing a mate. That's good, right? You wouldn't want your entire selection to be based on how a person smells. You hopefully have something in common and find the person visually attractive and all that sort of stuff, okay? But, it does seem that, at least to some degree, odor attractiveness does seem based on MHC compatibility. There's something else kind of interesting that goes on here that suggests that MHC might actually play a role, that the MHC and the complementarity, the compatibility might play a role in human behavior. First of all, it turns out that if a woman is dating somebody who has an MHC composition that doesn't complement their own, that is in fact too similar to their own, right? And it's going to leave gaps in their MHC, okay? If a woman is dating a man who doesn't have a complementary immune system but has one that's more similar to their own, they will be more likely to have extra relationship affairs and fantasies, okay? This always gets people kind of like alarmed, right? And you say, well, if I'm dating somebody, and I think this is true of heterosexual couples, I should mention. I don't think this is necessarily true of homosexual couples. But if I'm dating somebody or I'm married to somebody who has a very similar MHC to my own, then I'm going to have more chance that I'm going to cheat on them or at least be fantasizing about other men. Well, a lot of things go into that, of course. If you're getting along really well with somebody and they're kind to you and you do have a certain degree of romance, that might not happen. But looking over, big pools of data, it does seem the complementarity versus the kind of overlapping of common MHC structure does seem to have some influence over whether a woman will have an extra relationship affair or fantasies. Now, very often these pheromone studies are done with women because they do seem to show more of an influence often, but that research is still so new that it could very well work with men as well, but maybe not. It's not being tested in the right way. So I'm putting women in here because at the time I wrote the book, that's at least what it suggested, that women were influenced in that way. Okay. Also, that fact that a woman whose MHC has too much in common with a man they're dating will have fantasies and extra relationship affairs, that will increase during their ovulation. So, a lot of this stuff is done with questionnaires. So they'll take a sample from a woman, they'll take a sample from the person she's dating, the man she's dating, and they'll determine how, complementary versus overlapping their MHC is, and then ask them questions about how often do you fantasize about other men? Have you had extra relationship affairs? They will answer those questions more affirmatively. Yeah, I do have a lot of fantasies, and yeah, I have had extra relationship affairs, if they are in fact in the ovulation part of their cycle. Okay, so it increases during ovulation. Now, again, I know some questions are coming up, and I'm never surprised when this happens because this is a complicated sort of thing. But it seems that it's not going to determine if a person has an extra relationship affair or determine if they have fantasies, but it does have some influence, which is interesting. Is this based, like it seems to be, is the kind of, if not the mating selection, is the, romantic tendency towards a person in a human also based on odor like it is with mice, birds, fish, and lizards? It's unclear. But you do see a tendency for women to show this that's related to their structure of MHC as it pertains to the other person, their mate's MHC. Now, before we get too alarmed by this and jump online and look for sites that will allow us to pay for them to test our chemical compatibility. So this is something that exists. You can take a swab of your saliva and maybe take a swab of your spouse's or your significant other's saliva when they're sleeping or whatever, mail them in, and they'll tell you whether your MHC is compatible or not. Again, so much more goes into whether people are having successful relationships and successful romantic connections and all that. The fact that it does play any role at all is interesting. It might be an evolutionary holdover from what goes on in other mammals. That is interesting, but don't be alarmed. We're humans. Things are usually more complicated. The idea, according to Martha, is, again, what we're looking at is evidence that there are potentially odors that do, in fact, tell us something about the genetic compatibility of another person and can have very subtle but measurable effects on people. Okay, let's stop there and see if you have questions, and then I'll ask you a question. Great. William asks questions. So, if you are MHC compatible with someone, they are no. Okay, good question, William. I'm really glad you asked this question. Let me actually, the second part of the question might clarify this too. Just to clarify, in humans, MHC compatibility doesn't mean that they have complementary immune system, right? So people get a little confused on this. So I'm going to go through this slowly again. The idea is that what you are looking for, what your body and brain, when it comes to MHC is looking for potentially, is somebody who has a complementary MHC to your own. And what I mean here by complementary is compatible. You want somebody who has a compatible MHC. What you don't want is somebody who has an overlapping MHC, has the same MHC as you. You want somebody who has complementary MHC so that it fills your holes in your immune and autoimmune system. That's what I mean when I say complementary. I mean compatible too, in the same thing, right? If you don't have that, there's a chance, very small chance, but a chance that a woman in a relationship where there's too much genetic overlap will have fantasies about other people and potentially have extra relationship affairs. But again, these are very, very subtle effects. So I just want to make sure we understand that sort of thing. Okay, other questions about this? People often get very surprised that something like potentially smell can have influences over something like that. Let's keep in mind these are subtle effects. Anything else with this? Okay, let's do one quick question and then we'll take our break. All right. Yes, good one. Okay, this question has to do with menstrual entrainment. We just learned it. You should do well. So applying female sweat to the upper lip of a woman can, A, shorten their menstrual cycle by 2 to 3 days, B, lengthen their menstrual cycle by 2 to 3 days, C, both A and B, or D, none of the above. Think carefully about this one, okay? It's a tiny bit tricky, but we talked about the answer. So we determined once you answer, you can't change your answer, right? I know the polling function is one of the newest functions on Zoom. I think it did not exist until the spring, but it's useful. It's nice to provide practice questions and all that like we've been doing. Okay, all right, almost done. 5 more seconds. That will be a minute. And people struggle a little bit more with this one, which is fine. That can give me a chance to explain it to you. Okay, let me just finish there. Again, this is all anonymous. It has no bearing on your tests or your grade or anything like that. Okay, so applying female sweat to the upper, so you're taking the sweat from a woman during one part of her cycle. It's either the ovulation or pre-ovulation stage potentially, and applying that to women's upper lips, okay? And what's going to happen to the women's cycle who are receiving that odor from that? Now remember, there were 2 types of women that these were taken from, ovulating and pre-ovulating. They were taken from 2 different parts of the menstrual cycles, right? And as it turns out, that can have differential effects on the receiving women, so that if it's from an ovulating woman, it will slow down their cycles by a few days, okay? It will lengthen their cycles. If it is from a pre-ovulation woman, it will speed up their cycles by 2 to 3 days. So it is, A is true, it will shorten their menstrual cycles by 2 to 3 days. B is also true, it will lengthen their menstrual cycles by 2 to 3 days. And therefore, the correct response on this question would be C, both A and B. Okay? Cool. All right, it's 11:22. Let's take a 10-minute break and come back at 11:32. I'm sorry, I didn't share the results. Sorry. There you go, Kimberly. Take a picture of that. Now it's looking fine on my screen, which is nice. Okay, so let's come back at 11:32, and I'll see you all in 10 minutes. Hey, folks, ready to start? I'm a horse. Ha. Um, let's see. It looked like there were a couple of questions. Let me answer the questions first, and then we'll continue on this. I think it's a fascinating discussion on this stuff. Let's see here. Mr. Ed. Wow, Brittany. You know Mr. Ed? That's from my generation. Very impressive. Mr. Ed was a talking horse. They had a whole sitcom based on a talking horse and his owner, whom nobody believed had a talking horse, and that was the entire series. And boy, did we think that was funny. All right, here we go. Let's see. Chase asked a question. I have a question. You said shift, that doesn't necessarily mean lengthen cycle, just moves it when starts, which is different. Oh, Chase, that is a really good point. Okay, this is in regard to the last practice question I gave you. And I'm glad I'm answering this as a horse. I feel like I have less responsibility about this. This is a good point, Chase. I said shift the cycle and in the lecture, and then I said lengthen and shorten the cycle on the question, which I guess taken literally is a different thing. You're absolutely right. For that 1 month, I guess it is you can say a shift maybe is the same as lengthening and shortening. But after that, after that, the cycle is going to be probably the same length. It's just going to be a shift. So yeah, you're right about that, Chase. That is a really good point. I meant it to be the same thing here, but if it did mess people up, I apologize. I will. I'm worried about changing that. Well, I guess I'll change it in the test. I will say shift the cycle because that is what it says on the slides. I believe that is how I worded it in the book, but that is a really good catch, Chase. Let me change that on the test then. I mean, it should be obvious to you the answer is both, that it can go one way or the other way, depending on what odor you get. But I should say shift rather than lengthen. That's a really, really good point. Yep, someone's cycle could start earlier, but that doesn't mean that, yeah, okay, you're right. Chase is good. You caught that one. And Brittany enjoys Mr. Hi, Mr. Ed. Yeah, okay. Oh, yeah, Mr. Ed. There was a lot of shows like that back in those days. There was a show called My Favorite Martian, where a guy had a friend who was a Martian, and he did Martian things, but nobody believed he had a friend that was a Martian. There was a show called I Dream a Genie, where no one believed that this guy had I guess what turned out to be his wife that was a genie. Bewitched. There were tons of shows like that. And of course, there'd be a nosy neighbor who would always suspect something was going on, but no one would believe her either. Okay, there you go. All right, introduction to 1960s TV. All right, let's say goodbye to Mr. Ed. By the way, if you're really interested in Mr. Ed probably had the best theme song of any sitcom ever. You can look it up on YouTube. All right, let's go ahead and continue talking about this. All right, so let's remind ourselves of the big picture here. We are kind of doing what Martha McClintock has suggested, which is to kind of think about this issue, this kind of, I guess, quandary, this problem of whether humans have pheromones by kind of loosening our definition of what a pheromone might be. She's saying that the releaser and primer types that have been identified and have been discussed in the context of animals is probably too restrictive. That we can talk about some sort of kind of chemical signaling working through the smell system in humans, but the effects can be subtle. That doesn't mean they're not real effects, and it doesn't mean that they're not signals. And so she's asking us now to consider things like a signaler type pheromone, which we've been discussing, as well as modulator type pheromones. Which we'll discuss in just a second. But the signaler type pheromones we've just mentioned are the sort of things that we've been seeing with these T-shirt tests, and how we can detect things like our kin and our friends and our romantic partners, and then how it can signal something maybe deeper, like the immune compatibility with a potential mate. Okay. There's other things that could signal too, which I think you'll find really, really interesting. So you can see this slide was called, the odor of compatibility, and that's, referring to the fact that that this MHC seems to potentially talk about, or potentially pertain to the compatibility and the immune systems between ourselves and those of other people that we might procreate with. But there's also this other thing that it seems to signal: symmetry. What does that mean, symmetry? What we're talking about here is the symmetry in an individual's body or in an animal's body. And this is something that's studied, especially in biology and zoology, about animals, body symmetry as it's defined as having, things like limbs of the same length and hooves and things like that. As you can see there's as showing a horse that has different shaped hooves, different shaped front hooves, and might in fact signal something about the genetic health of the animal. And so we know that this is true of animals, that animals that have what we call low body symmetry, in other words, they have limbs that don't match very well in terms of leg length, or their hooves, their feet are different in some apparent way, that animals that don't have good symmetry often have other problems. They have slower growth. They have reduced longevity, so they don't live as long as animals that do have more symmetric bodies, and they tend to be less fertile, suggesting that, yes, they might not have the same genetic health as animals that do seem to display more symmetry in their bodies. Now, before we get too deep into talking about this with humans now, do be aware that if you were to absolutely measure the length of your two hands, you would find there's a little difference in them. But we're talking about pretty big differences here, whether they are in human appendages or animal appendages. And often we're talking about symmetry, by the way, as it would be kind of defined, kind of taking a bisection down here of the vertical length of their bodies. You look at a horse from the front, like you just were, or you can, there's horses running around now. You can see, you look at them from the front, and you find that the symmetry would appear less in the balance between their two body kind of shapes, the two sides of their body shape. So that's what's meant by symmetry here, is it's kind of cutting down the middle. Okay. And we know that low symmetry in an animal does often come with lower fertility, reduced longevity, and slower growth. With people, if especially their face is less symmetric, it is accompanied by things as well. So there, I'll tell you, if you want to go online and find people that have asymmetric faces, many of those images will come from perpetrator or suspect lineups. Like this poor individual here does. As you can see, I mean, it's not wildly different, but clearly the left side of his face looks different from the right side of his face. So if you were to, kind of just take a little imaginary line and draw it right down the front of his nose down here in the middle of his face, there'd be some asymmetries to the two sides of his face. And that is known, when you see that type of asymmetry, that is known to be associated sometimes with things like a lower IQ and worse physical and mental health. So individuals who have less symmetry in their faces will often have more mental health problems, more physical problems, in addition to the asymmetry, which might or might not cause problems, as well as a lower IQ. It's been known for a long time that this is the case. Now, again, we're talking about big examples of the big data sets of this. So maybe we can all think about people that we know, or maybe even ourselves. We look in the mirror and we see that, I'm not as symmetric as I could be. It really depends where that asymmetry comes from. If it in fact is caused by certain types of very subtle genetic shifts, genetic aberrations, then those aberrations could often come with physical and mental health and lower IQ problems. If it comes from something else, for whatever reason, some sort of injury, something that happened in utero, that asymmetry, then it very well might not. So again, if you look in the mirror, you're looking at your friends and you see a little asymmetry there, first of all, it's got to be more than just a little. Secondly, it's not always associated with these issues, but sometimes they are. People that have asymmetric faces to this degree will have somewhat more likely problems with mental, physical health, and lower IQs. Okay, just so you know. That's with faces. With bodies, there's been research on the symmetry in bodies in humans. And what you find with people, now what we're doing is we're measuring more than just their facial symmetry. We're measuring their body symmetry too, the length of their limbs, the kind of, is there kind of an equal spreading of the musculature across the two sides of the body like that, up here and down by the legs. And what you find is, again, if these are based on, the symmetry is based on a genetic sort of cause, is that people that have higher symmetry usually have more sexual partners, and believe it or not, they are known men who have high body symmetry and probably high facial symmetry as well, seem to be able to, for whatever reason, induce more copulatory orgasms in women for whatever reason. Okay, but you do find that these kind of behavioral sort of patterns, maybe kind of psychosexual sort of patterns, are associated with symmetry in humans, and possibly in a kind of parallel way to how they exist in animals. Okay, just to kind of lay that out. What's this have to do with smell? Well, if you then take t-shirts and put them on men that have high symmetry and men that have lower symmetry, and ask women to smell those t-shirts and determine which they like better. If a woman is especially in what's considered one of the most sensitive periods, the sensitive smelling periods, where she's really sensitive to male scent, which would be her fertile phase, she will most likely say that she likes the smell of the symmetric man's t-shirt better. So now they're not looking at the person at all. They're not looking at the facial symmetry. They're not looking at the bodily symmetry. They're having no visual access to this person at all. They're just smelling the t-shirts. The smell of the t-shirt that comes from a man whose body is symmetric, as measured by various ways, will smell better to them than the t-shirt who's been worn by a man who's less symmetric, like that poor individual there. And so, like body symmetry might be a signal of a genetic health, okay? The smell that's associated with that might also be something that signals genetic health. So yes, genetic compatibility seems to be signaled possibly, but genetic health also seems to be signaled in a way, right? So we can tell something about the genetic health as it's associated with symmetry, which is also something that could signal about genetic health through smell. And Martha McClintock would say, hey, that's a great example of a signaling type of pheromone, in this case, signaling general genetic health that is also correlated with the symmetry sort of dimension, okay? And for whatever reason, ovulation seems to heighten women's sensitivity to this. They seem to be more sensitive to the genetic health signaling that's associated with the anatomy, the symmetric anatomy of a person that exists in smell when they're ovulating, which is really interesting. So that's something else that can, I think, can be classified as a nice example of a signaler pheromone. Not only are we getting signals about who a person is, if they're related to us genetically, if we know them, if they're male or female, and if they have compatible MHC to our own, compatible autoimmune and immune systems, we also might, to some degree, be able to smell the genetic health, at least as a woman is ovulating, smelling men's t-shirts. It seems that that is something that is also an example of a signaler pheromone. And here's one final one. Fertile phase. No, there's two more. Sorry, two more. Another example of women smelling men. When a woman is in her fertile phase, she will generally say she likes the smell of a man's t-shirt who has been rated as dominant by other men. Okay, this one's a little freaky. So you get 10 friends together, 10 male friends together, and you ask them to be, it's a completely anonymous thing. Everyone has to rate, kind of the alpha male, and then how it kind of scales down from there within the 10. And you're going to get some, I think if I were asked to do this with my 10 friends, they'd say, no, we're all equal. We all like to think of ourselves as alpha sometimes, and then followers other times. But I said, no, just, maybe, throughout your lives, were some of you a little bit more dominant than others, that sort of thing. Say, okay. The men that were rated as dominant by the other men actually have t-shirts, have a scent signature conveyed through a t-shirt that a woman likes better when she is in her fertile phase. Okay, I know there's a lot of other things that play a role in selecting a mate besides dominance, right? I mean, there's some very prominent kind of, I guess you call them alpha men, in politics and stuff like that, who I think are, despicable. But when you're looking at these sort of smell studies, and there's, when a woman's in her fertile phase smelling different t-shirts, she will often pick the smell of the man that is most dominant more often as being attractive. Which is, it's kind of, you think about these sort of things as kind of being, kind of beneath, us as humans and sophisticated kind of complex beings. Yeah, sure, monkeys might have this alpha male, dogs might have this alpha male thing, but for us, it's so complicated. What defines alpha male? When I was a kid, if you were a nerd, that was not alpha male, but now kind of nerds are kind of taking over the world, right? The richest people in the world are nerds, right? Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, those guys. So, of course that can change, but when it comes to something as basic as smell, some of those old kind of animal sort of influences seem to play a role. Okay. That doesn't mean that a woman's going to marry a dominant man by any means, like a bully or something like that, but it does seem to be something that influences scent attractiveness, if nothing else. And then in one of the few studies that involves asking men to rate the smell of t-shirts worn by women, okay, I said most of these things that we've been discussing with pheromones that go the other way, but here's one where men are smelling women's t-shirts. They like the smell of fertile women better than women that are going through their menstrual, their period, the menstrual part of their month, okay? In fact, pre-fertile and post-fertile, they'll still like the fertile periods better. Again, let's make sure we understand the context of this experiment. Women are just wearing t-shirts, maybe providing t-shirts from different parts of the month, as an example. A woman would wear a t-shirt during the fertile part, during the pre-ovulation, during post-ovulation, during the menstrual period of the month, and then give the t-shirts to a man who's smelling. Which smell do you like better? The man is most likely to say it's the t-shirt, this one right here, and that would be the one from her fertile, period of the month. Okay. which is really interesting. And you're going to see this later on when it comes to multisensory, perceiving people and their attractiveness through multisensory means. Do people look different? Do women look different during their fertile period? Do they sound different during their fertile period? Do they smell different during their fertile period? And here you have one of the answers to those questions, that women do seem to be subtly different in their odor emanation during their fertile period, and men seem to prefer that out of all the smells throughout the rest of the month, suggesting something interesting that we didn't used to think was true. That fertility, which seems to be signaled so strongly in other animals, right? We know about all these signalers of fertility in chimps and monkeys and a lot of other animals where they really look different. Where they really look different when they're in their fertile phase. So there's no question about it, right? Birds too, they change during their fertile phase. We always used to think, for whatever reason, humans aren't really like this. They don't signal their fertile phase very much. But maybe that's not completely true. Maybe they do signal it in ways that are more subtle, certainly, but are still signaling nonetheless. And that would be clearly another really interesting example of a signaler pheromone that's being conveyed through scent. Right? So all these things would be great examples of signaler pheromones, that we can in fact pick up all these things through smell. So I want to tell you about these things because I think they're fascinating. It's unclear how much of an influence they have over our kind of big behaviors of choosing mates and all that stuff. But the fact that they have any influence at all is really interesting. And I also want to tell you this because I think these are really good examples of what Martha McClintock thought were signaler pheromones. That, yeah, we need to kind of expand our idea of what pheromones might be. They might be subtle little signals telling us something about a person and, what the person is going through in terms of their reproduction potential, their potential to have offspring at any given time during the month. Okay, cool. Let's go on now, and I think those are a great set of examples for signaler pheromones. Let's go on and talk about the other type we talked about that Martha McClintock suggested, that rather than thinking about any sort of pheromone that is going to induce a behavioral change as inducing a reflexive behavioral change, let's think of subtle changes. And here are changes in things like mood, emotion, other sorts of kind of emotional experiences, and these would be the modulator pheromone types that she mentioned. That here, what we're talking about are things that can subtly influence, kind of our emotional state, that then might be reflected in subtle sorts of responses. And we've already talked about one of these. I think one that's a fairly compelling example of it, and that's the fear, right? You're smelling somebody's fearful smell, somebody who's about to go into a test, somebody who's on a roller coaster, and yeah, all these things, cool things happen. I'm not going to play the noisy slap thing again, noisy percussion instrument again, but that induces an eye blink, okay? It induces, it doesn't induce an eye blink. The eye blink is induced, I should be clear about this. The eye blink is going to happen from the sound. The speed and the amplitude, how big that eye blink is going to be modulated by getting a smell of a scared person, okay? You need the sound to induce the eye blink. I want to make sure you understand that. It's the quickness, the speed of the eye blink and how big it is. Cool. That's a nice example of modulator pheromones. Really nice example, I think. But are there other ones? And here's where we kind of get into the type of pheromones that you may have heard of before. The type of pheromones that are thought to be related to things like romance or, I don't know, I guess sexual attractiveness and things like that. Okay. Can in fact change us in ways that make us become more attracted to a person and behave in a way. It's a modulator pheromone, so we need to talk about a way, is it going to change our behavior towards a person? Not just signaling someone's attractive, but is it going to affect our behavior in subtle ways? Well, here's what we know. Putative means that we think that it is possibly a pheromone that's in men's sweat, can have an effect on a woman's mood, heart rate, skin moisture, and cortisol levels. So, go ahead and if you're writing them down, you can go ahead and write those down. But I will talk about each of them separately. So now we're not just talking about, a woman's kind of ratings of how good something smells. Now we're wondering if that smell from a man can actually induce very subtle either, metabolism or mood changes in a person. And yes, if this, what we think is a pheromone compound in men, is presented to women at an undetected level, subliminal level, okay, it does raise their mood a tiny bit, and that's based on self-rated mood. What's your mood now on a scale from 1 to 10? How positive or negative is it? They come in as a 5 or 6. Yeah, it's a normal day. Okay, and they are then presented the smell of a man's odor that we think is related to pheromones from the man. And they'll say, okay, maybe 6 or 7. It's a subtle difference, but it is measurable. It is something that's, shows some consistency from woman to woman to some degree. Their heart rate will also go up as they're being presented this sub-threshold smell from a man. They will sweat a little more, and maybe you know about how to measure sweat if you've ever studied, physiology or neuropsych or something, or a lie detector test or something, that something called a galvanic skin response, don't worry about the technical term, will be subtle moisture coming from a woman's skin. It's a little bit of a sweat response, but it's very subtle sweat response. You wouldn't necessarily notice it unless you were measuring it with special tools. Women's skin moisture does increase a little bit if they are being subjected to an undetectable odor from a man. And then finally, their cortisol levels will go up. And that can be measured by taking, saliva samples from the woman's mouth. You will find that raises a little bit as well. Again, very subtle effects, very subtle, unconscious to the woman, except for maybe the mood. She might notice that it's a little better than it used to be, but certainly the heart rate and skin moisture and cortisol levels are so subtle she will not notice these sort of things. But you do find a little bit of a modulation of these things when exposed to a man's smell. Okay, what else? Sexual arousal. Okay, so here's the deal. This is the one that people are most familiar with, possibly because of the way it's presented in popular culture. You can find, sites on the internet that try to sell you synthetic pheromones that will make you, irresistible to somebody and arouse their sexual interests and all that sort of thing. It doesn't work like that. It can have a very subtle effect. So this is how it works. And again, it's one of those women tests. So women are asked to go, on the internet or whatever. That actually was an old experiment. I guess they were shown what, people might consider an arousing film. Nothing too awful, just, something romantic that led to a bedroom scene or something like that women often said was arousing. And were asked then to rate how aroused they became from that film clip. Okay, if in fact they were being presented an undetectable odor from a man, maybe a pheromone from a man, they would say that their arousal was a little higher than if they were not being presented that undetectable odor. Okay, now the sexual arousal itself is coming from watching the film clip, certainly, but it does, being exposed unconsciously to a man's scent might have a woman rate her arousal a tiny bit higher than if she wasn't being exposed to that odor. It's not inducing the sexual arousal, the film's doing that, but it is modulating it a bit so it's a little bit higher. And in this sense, and this is really, really important, I want to make sure this is very clear in our discussion of pheromones, it isn't too much different from listening to romantic music or turning down the lights. Really? I mean, this chapter is called Marvin Gaye for Your Nose. Okay, so there's Marvin Gaye right there, that little picture. I don't know about what you folks listen to. Maybe if you're in a romantic mood with your significant other, but my generation listened to Marvin Gaye. Man, Marvin Gaye's great. You probably have heard some stuff. But we don't know. Drake, is that kind of considered romantic music? I don't know. But Marvin Gaye was from my generation. And if you wanted to heighten the mood a little bit, you put on Marvin Gaye, or you certainly turn down the lighting. What else can you do? You can put candles around the room. You just kind of change the mood a little bit, and it's a little bit more romantic, right? That is how you probably should think of how a pheromone can influence a person's feelings of sexual arousal. It is kind of more just, setting the mood. And yeah, it might induce a little bit more of a self-rating of higher arousal or something like that. But probably so would Marvin Gaye. So if the women watching these sexy movies were asked to rate their arousal, I bet you they'd rate it higher if the lights in the room they were watching in were dimmer than if the lights were really bright. Don't you agree? That you would probably be more affected by the romantic aspects of the movie if the lights were down. Women might say they were more sexually aroused than if it was bright, like it is in here right now. I've got lights shining on me here. That just kind of ruins the romance to some degree. Having it lighter, having it darker, is kind of adds to the romance. So that's how you should think of this. You should think of the pheromone influence like lighting in a room. Okay. The difference is, of course, that it does happen at this kind of subliminal level very often. And for that reason, it seems like it's a little bit more mysterious, a little bit more magical. But it's just like turning down the lights. It's the same type of thing. Or putting on Marvin Gaye music, exactly. One more thing I wanted to mention, just so you understand that, this is not like you're smelling a man and therefore you're going to be kind of ready for romance immediately or something like that. These things are so subtle and so complicated that there's another smell you might be very surprised has the same effect on women and how they'll rate arousing film clips or something like that, or sexual fantasies. And it's the smell, of all things, of another woman nursing. And this has always been a really interesting finding to me. I speculate a little bit of what it might be about based on what I've read, but just like potentially a man's pheromone can kind of modulate one's kind of sexual feelings a teeny tiny bit. Think about the lights being turned down. It's that much, right? The other smell that seems to do it is the smell of another woman nursing. It seems to have a subtle but measurable influence on sexual fantasies and sexual desires. And I think also in these same sort of experiments where people are, the women are watching kind of sexy films, right? I mean, why would that work? What would that do? And what is speculated, and I talk a little bit more about this in the book, but we can just mention it here, is that what it might do to some degree is kind of help pregnancy in a group of women be coordinated, especially you think about our ancestors or about other, other animals. There are some advantages for a group of people living together, a group of women living together that are of young age that can have children, and a group of animals living together, if they can coordinate the pregnancy, if they're around the same time, they can share resources, they can protect each other, they can, help each other, with each other's children and all that sort of thing. There is an advantage to doing that. So what might happen here is that, when you first smell another woman or another animal, probably this works with chimps as well, I would imagine, nursing, that might put you a little bit more in the mood. So you would have, offspring relatively quickly, and you both have young children around the same time. That's what's thought to occur. But, this idea that a man's smell is going to make a woman do something is so much more complex. First of all, it's so much more subtle. It's much more like turning down the lights or putting on Marvin Gaye music. And secondly, it's not the only type of smell that does that. It's the smell from another woman who happens to be nursing that can also do that type of thing, again, at such a subtle level. So let's do a kind of big review thing on subliminal odors. And this is kind of the big picture here. The effects of subliminal odors, as I've been saying, are subtle and complex. Okay, certainly. It is not like that piggy. Okay, it is not like, you know, you smell the smell of a potential mate and you are reflexively going to behave in a certain way like we believe the pig does. For human pheromones, it's much more subtle. Oh, by the way, there is I don't think that's actually an older picture, but this is one of the pheromone concentrates that was sold on the internet. If you'd like to spend money on them, it doesn't work. Okay, and hopefully you understand why now. But for human pheromones, I think we do find that these are kind of very useful classes of pheromones to discuss. So the chemical signal that can the chemical signal that can tell you something about, who this person is based on a t-shirt smell or something. This is kin, this is a romantic partner, this is male or female, this is somebody that has compatible MHC, or this is somebody who has genetic health. Those are really good examples, I think, of singular pheromones. The modulator pheromones discussed have been the fearful thing, right? It has a very subtle but modulating effect on how quickly we will respond to a loud sound. It has a subtle effect on things like how we interpret faces if we smell a fearful person's smell. And then these other examples with sexual arousal, maybe increasing heart rate a little bit, sweat. These can all be considered examples that have been influenced by the kind of subliminal smells of another person potentially, but they're very, very subtle. What about primer? Well, there was that, I don't know if I mentioned this for, releaser, but let me just remind you of primer. Primer, okay, there is evidence for primer, we think, right, after going through today's discussion. We think that there's evidence that, in fact, we can be influenced by menstrual cycles, by the pheromones that are released at various points in a menstrual cycle. That menstrual synchrony or entrainment, we believe, occurs, and that seems to be shifted by having exposure to the odors of another person. And then releaser, there's very little for that. Remember, just like the pig example, we don't go into a mating stance or anything like that. We don't run away when we smell a fearful smell. The only one that I forgot to mention, I think, was there is a little bit of evidence that newborn infants will, I guess, reflexively crawl to the smell of their mother. It's a little controversial because it's unknown whether it's truly a reflex, or, when you're dealing with infants, it's hard to really determine these things. But that might be one of the only examples. But I think for the most part, we can say humans don't display influences of a releaser pheromone like animals do. Okay. But, and this is a really interesting thing that Martha told me, we have to be careful about what we assume animals are doing as well. So, especially in the historic research having to do with biological sorts of reactions in biology, how biology sees reactions in animals, we often don't think of them as very kind of conscious sort of beings, in the sense that we think of ourselves as being able to be conscious and think things through. We think about behaviors a lot as being reflexive. They happen, more dramatically, it seems. It's the ants running away, the pig going into the mating stance. They happen seemingly all the time. Okay, but are they truly reflexive? That's the question. And so are animals also, are animals just showing the influences of primer and releaser pheromones, or are they also sensitive to the signaler and modulator pheromones that we consider are relevant to humans? And Martha said, let's realize that we don't know for certain that this idea of a releaser pheromone, the idea that this chemical messenger can come and induce a reflexive behavior, is true. We don't know what we can count as a reflex versus a choice to do something, right? We assume that ants don't have much of a consciousness, so we assume that if we see them running, it's a reflex, right? The same thing with pigs, right? But as it turns out, she said, if you go back and look at the literature with the pig, for example, the pig doesn't reflexively go into its mating stance when it smells a male pig, okay? It needs more than that. It needs the sound of the pig nearby or the sight of the pig nearby. If it's just smelling, if you put a little earbuds into the female pig so it can't really hear what's around it, it won't go into its mating stance even though it's being exposed to the smell of a male pig. It needs to also hear. It also won't do it just for sound. It has to hear and smell. So it's a more complex influence that's inducing this mating stance. It's not like a reflex that just occurs from a chemical signal. So animals might also be more complex and might also be subject to these signaler and modulator pheromones, such that the idea that there's a releaser pheromones that works in animals might not have a lot of validity to it. Okay? So it could very well be, certainly the way we think of ourselves, and possibly the way we think of animals to some degree too, that the influences of subliminal odor are not determinate. There certainly don't seem to be very many examples in humans besides maybe menstrual entrainment, but in animals even, there might not be examples where there is an odor that automatically causes a behavior. We should think of these things as signaling different types of animals and humans and what we can learn about that, or having subtle effects that then play a role in kind of the big decisions that we have to make. Are we in a romantic enough mood to go along with this? Do we like this person enough to engage in a romantic relationship with them? And yeah, you might be a little bit more enticed if you have the lights down, or if you have Marvin Gaye on, or if you're being exposed to the male scent. But if you don't like the person, you don't like the person, right? You're not going to be reflexively, hypnotically coerced into doing something you don't want. And that might also be, to some degree, true of animals as well. Okay. That ends our discussion of smell. So let's take a little break here and answer some questions. Great. Great question. Kimberly asked this question. If the female pig had all the signals except the pheromone, would she still go into the mating stance? I actually don't know the answer to that question offhand, Kimberly. That's a great, great question. That mating stance has historically always been associated with a pheromone influence, but it could be, we do know that they need more than just the pheromone influence. It could be that maybe if they have a combination of everything except the pheromone, that would be enough for them to go into the mating stance. I would not be surprised if that was the case. I think the whole concept of pheromones and reflexive reactions to pheromones in humans and certainly in humans and probably in animals is being rethought. So it might be just like, for people, if you've got enough information and you're in that time, the estrus time of the month, and you've got enough information that there's a male that's ready to procreate, that you don't need the pheromone in it. It's a really, really good question. Yeah. Other questions about this stuff? I think this stuff's so interesting. And I hope you're getting the right message in terms of how I really want you to interpret this, that we seem to have all of these kind of, at least evolutionary remnants, where things that we know other animals have, we also have to subtle degrees, that these things can have very subtle influences, kind of signal and modulate very subtle behaviors, but they are not determinate. Think of Marvin Gaye for your nose, okay? Other questions about this? Other questions on subliminal smell? Okay, let's do a poll. Let's do a test question. Okay, very, very simple. Very simple because I just talked about it. Considering the four type of pheromone influences that Martha McClintock wants to entertain. Which type of pheromone might act to increase a woman's mood and heart rate? Would it be the signaler, the modulator, the releaser, or the primer? It's just on 2 slides ago, should be able to do it. Okay, you got about 30 seconds. Looks like most of you are getting it. Another 10 seconds. I think, let's see how many people. All right. Yeah, most of you got this one right. So the correct answer is in fact B, modulator. Remember, the signaler pheromones are the ones that are going to tell us something about, you know, the whether somebody's related to us, whether they're kin, whether it's a male or female, possibly what time in the month they are in. And of course, the genetic compatibility and the genetic health, those things are all signaler pheromones. Releaser are going to be the sort of things where a kind of reflexive behavior is induced from a pheromone. Primer is going to be more like having to do with menstrual entrainment. It's the modulator ones that seem to have kind of an influence over us, but very subtle in the sense of modulating mood to some degree, heart rate. The other things we looked at were cortisol level, skin sweat, and potentially, to some degree, self-ratings of arousal. Okay, so the answer is, in fact, B, modulator. Okay, take a picture if you haven't. And let's continue. All right, any last questions about smell before we start talking about taste? All right, you guys are asking good questions. Then let's go. Let's take a second. Just need to switch up the slides here. You know, I've got a movie, but I think I can try to show it. Let me try to show it. All right. So I'm going to share. And if you've read ahead in the book, you know the story here. Okay, again, taste was one of these things I knew nothing about. You know, as a perceptual psychology professor, I knew a lot about, you know, seeing and hearing and touching, but taste and smell, just kind of push them to the back of the course. And boy, did I love going through this information. It was so cool. So this is how things worked. Before I started doing my reading on taste to find the cool stuff to talk about in the book and what kind of taste skills that we had that we didn't know about having, I decided to do something kind of interesting with my wife and some friends. We went to what's called a dark restaurant. And I don't know if you've ever heard of these. There are a bunch around the world. I think they started in Europe. There were a few in Germany and Switzerland, and then they came to America. And there is, in fact, one in Los Angeles. It's now moved to Santa Monica, but it's the same owners, same idea. It's a restaurant in which the interior is completely dark. There is nothing you can see in these restaurants. It is amazing. I mean, it was a really interesting experience. I have never been in such a dark place in my life. I mean, there was nothing you could see. You had no way of orienting yourself, you know, to anything in the restaurant. You know, people were told if they had like, you know, everyone had to shut off their cell phone, of course, and they were told if they had like these glowed watches or something, they had to put them in their pockets. They wanted nothing to be seen in the restaurant. And the way it was advertised was, this will allow you to have a dinner in which you experience the food without any distractions. You experience the meal without you know, visual distractions of seeing the food, but also the visual distractions of looking around the restaurant, seeing people in the table, even seeing your friends there. I mean, you know, we went with friends, so it was kind of a fun thing to share. But the real reason I wanted to go is because I wanted to kind of see if I had the experience that they were advertising, that you would really be able to taste the food purely. You'd really be able to concentrate and taste the food the way it was meant to be tasted. Okay, I'm going to tell you about my experience in just a second, but I have a little video here that kind of gives a little expose of the restaurant I went to. It's actually the restaurant. Hopefully it will work okay. Usually you can hear things okay through Zoom and see, you know, it's a little staggered, but you can see images okay, a little movement, that sort of thing. If you can't hear anything, let me know and I'll stop it, but hopefully you'll be able to at least hear it. Oop. Oh my gosh, it's not going to let me show it. Oh my gosh. Let me see very quickly if I can find it on my computer. Oh, crap. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Oh, I can't find it. Okay, that's all right. That's all right. I will tell you what it's like. It's a fun experience. I'll just have to act it out. Shoot. Okay. Hold on just a second. Oh, I can't believe it won't show it to me. I don't know if it's because of the copyright problems or something else, but I am not able to show this, sadly. Oh boy, hold on just a second. I am having a little trouble here now sharing my screen for whatever reason. Here we go. Okay, good. Hopefully you're seeing that first slide again. Okay, so this is what it's like. We went, we went to the restaurant. It was in a hotel at the time. It was on Sunset Boulevard. I don't know if you're very familiar with the street. You know, the Sunset Strip. The restaurant was in a hotel. I think the Hyatt, if you know where that is. It's now moved to Santa Monica. But when it was in the Hyatt, what you do is you go into the lobby of the hotel, and then right off the lobby was where the restaurant was. And you would sit in the lobby before you go in, and the hostess would come out and give us this really odd menu. And the menu was kind of set up so it had like little windows on it. And she said, okay, here's what you can do. You can go in there and be totally surprised by what we're going to serve you. That would be the first thing. You can tell us what type of foods you like and don't like, and then we'll choose something for you. Like if you want the vegetarian or the chicken or the beef, and then we'll choose something for you based on that selection. Or you can go ahead and just order regularly. Now, my friends, my wife and my two friends, couple that we went with, were scared. I mean, this is really weird. Oh, and I should mention, one of the reasons they were scared is because there was a person sitting outside in the lobby shaking. I forgot to mention this, yeah. She was gripping a glass of wine and she was shaking. And we went up and said, what's going on? She goes, I'm just too scared. This is the scariest thing I've ever had to do in my life. It's so dark in there. I just had to leave. And it got us a little nervous. As it turns out, she was fine. And she ended up going back in to the restaurant. She was okay. I think maybe the wine helped a little bit. But we were a little concerned. So my wife and my friends ordered, exactly what they wanted. I decided I'll have the vegetarian dish. I felt that was the safest. And so we go in, and all of the waiters are visually impaired. And the idea is because they're used to, being able to get around without using sight, whether they're, using echolocation or just listening for sounds coming from tables, they're able to, guide us in. And that's exactly what this waiter did. He guided us in with us holding each other's shoulders. So we kind of went in as a line. And the second you get in there and they close the door, it is the darkest place here I've ever been in. And then you sit down and, they start serving bread and we order drinks and stuff like that. And it's interesting, people, you heard other tables, people talking at other tables, but it was really hard to make out what anyone was saying. It sounded kind of like a garbled background sound. When you're in a restaurant and you're looking around, you can catch words here and there. You really couldn't. You couldn't see what people were saying. You couldn't watch them talking to each other. So it really made it much harder for us to understand. It almost sounded like, how they do fake background talking at a party, that's on a television episode or something. You kind of say, it sounds really indistinct. That's how it seemed in the restaurant, even though I'm sure people were having normal conversations. So the bread comes and we taste it, and it is warm and it feels good, but we notice as we're eating it, it's like, the texture's nice, but it doesn't seem to have very much flavor. I then have a sip of my beer. I ordered a beer, which I've had many times. I don't know, Sierra Nevada or something like that. It's like, it tastes a little watery to me. And then little by little, as we're getting these different dishes, our experience was the same. That everything had a lack of flavor. It seemed less flavorful to us. And it wasn't just, one person's entree wasn't that good or another person's appetizer or dessert wasn't that good. Everything we've had, including this beer that came out of a bottle, I don't think it was watered down, nothing really tasted as good as it should. And it's an expensive restaurant, and you think that, no matter how bad the chef is, not every dish is going to be bland. But that is what our experience was. Everything tasted bland. It was a fun experience. I don't want to, I was a little I don't think I actually named the restaurant in the book because I was a little nervous to advertise it as having bland food, but it was it was bland food. The experience of it itself was really interesting, I have to say. It's a little high price for an interesting experience, but if you get a chance, it might be a fun thing to do. My entree came, for example, and I really didn't know what it was. You're kind of making, as you have to kind of use your fingers a little bit to touch the food to know where to scoop up things and stuff. As it turns out, it was like a vegetarian Thai dish. And I recognized the spices and stuff like that. It tasted bland. But at one point, I put something in my mouth, and I had no idea what it was. I really didn't. It kind of had the consistency and the shape, it's going to sound gross, of a human finger. It really did. And I'm starting to chew on this thing. Oh my God, what is this? And I thought, oh my gosh, maybe it's not just the servers that are blind. Maybe the chef is blind too, No, it wasn't. That's not what happened. It was a carrot, but it was a lightly steamed carrot, so it was a tiny bit chewy, like they are, and it did have the shape of a finger. So, but we all had little kind of comic experiences like that. It was a kind of a bonding experience. We had a good time, but the food was bland, which was really surprising based on what we kind of expected. Okay. If there's questions about the restaurant, by the way, go ahead and ask them now, and I'll answer them later. You might be interested in other details. But let me go on and talk about this issue. In dark restaurants, should the food taste better? I mean, they're right. You're not being distracted by looking at other people. You're not being distracted by, the decor of the place. There's no decor. It's completely black. It's not that, there's not a lot of flashy things going on because you can't see anything. So shouldn't the food taste better? And we all after the discussion, I went home and I started looking at the research. I mean, what happens when you can't see your food? What happens when you can't see your food? And as it turns out, the first thing I read about, with the research is that individuals who either go blind spontaneously, in other words, they have an accident and they lose their sight, or are blindfolded for any period of the time, often report having trouble tasting their food. They say that food tastes more bland. You remember like when we were talking about the gentleman with anosmia, food tasted bland. It's the same thing almost, that if you can't see your food, it does often taste more bland. Individuals who are blind, for a long period of time, they learn to compensate for this. But if you wear a blindfold and sit down at a meal, there's a good chance it will taste more bland, like our experience exactly. What else? Well, if you then look at the research to see how a food's appearance influences how it tastes, things start becoming very clear. Now, you folks might know more about this than me, and hooray for your generation. You folks are much better cooks. My kids are better cooks than me because they grew up watching these cooking shows. A lot of them are so fun to watch. The cooking battles with Gordon Ramsay and all that sort of stuff. And it really kind of gets young people interested in cooking. You probably know, if you watch those shows or if you've done cooking yourself, that the appearance of a food, the way something looks on a plate, does influence how people like it. I mean, it's something that they judge. It's something that judges will look at and say, that's a nice presentation. Okay? And it turns out that it's not only going to make the food more appealing, it's actually going to have an effect on how flavorful it seems. And that research is very clear when you look at its simple things, just like fruit drinks. So imagine, I know you folks maybe drink, I know my kids drink these kind of power drinks, Powerades and different things like that, right? And they're colored, they're obviously artificially colored and mostly artificially flavored, even though they have these, kind of, fairly healthy things. They're a lot healthier than what I drank when I was a kid, which was Kool-Aid and High C, which it was all sugar and fake color and fake flavor. But even with these Powerade drinks, people will say the fruit flavor they taste will depend on what color they see the drink as. And what I mean by that is that if you serve somebody a drink that has been flavored with an orange flavor, but put red dye in it, and then ask them how it tastes, what flavor is this? They are more likely to say it's a cherry flavor than an orange flavor, even though it's been an orange flavor compound in it. Same thing, just the opposite. You put a clear cherry flavoring into, say, carbonated water, and then color it with orange food coloring and ask them, what flavor is this drink? They're more likely to say orange than they are cherry. So what flavor, at least a fruit drink seems to be, is more dependent on the color of the drink than on the actual tasted components, the ones that go onto your tongue, that should really have a bearing on how it seems. I mean, it doesn't happen. It's not always the case that this is going to occur. People will sometimes see the orange drink and say, well, I think it's orange, but it's not a very good orange. Or I think it's cherry, but not a very good cherry. But they will more likely say it's the flavor depending on what color they see than what they actually get on their tongue, which is interesting. And in addition to that, this I think is definitely something that goes into your Powerade drinks, that how intense the flavor seems depends on how bright the color is in the drink. So my older son likes, what is it, dragon fruit or dragonberry Powerade or something like that. He's always like that. I mean, he always asks me to go into 7-Eleven and get him these things when we're taking trips and stuff. And if you drink that without looking at it, it doesn't have a lot of flavor. But what is it? Is bright red or pink or something? I'm colorblind. I don't know. Let's say it's red. It's a bright red drink. If you look at it, it does seem to have more flavor, right? It does seem to have more of a flavor. based on the color. So the intensity of the color, how bright it is. Is it a dilute red? Is it kind of, you can see a little red shading in the water. It's not going to taste as intense as if it's a very, very striking red, even if the flavor components are exactly the same. And this isn't just true of fruit drinks. It's been shown true of cookies and custards and cakes. And when it comes to those sort of things, especially a lot of this research on flavor comes from custards, because, and there's a picture of a custard there, because custards, puddings, things like that are very easy to kind of manipulate in terms of what color they seem and how thick they seem, and then what the flavor components are that go into them, and then the smell components. We know that scent, our sense system plays an important role. You know this from section, that your sense system plays an important role in how something tastes. So custards are a really nice example of this. And what we know is that not only is it the color that can influence how something tastes, but the texture can influence how something tastes. In other words, if you can see a texture in a custard that looks thick, so you're looking at the custard and it looks thick, then it's going to influence things like how much sugar you need in order to make it seem like a sweeter custard. So how a custard looks in terms of its color, yes, in terms of its color, brightness, its intensity, but also in terms of its visible texture will influence how it seems. And what I mean here by facilitating discrimination, it's easier to determine whether these are two different custards if you can see them than just taste them. Okay, the texture of a custard is going to be what's going to kind of help that. So here's another great example of how vision can influence how we taste things, and in this case, how sensitive our experience of taste is. And I should say that these effects are truly perceptual. And what I mean by that is they really, really seem that they affect how we have our initial perceptual experience. So even after, this is one way of kind of establishing that it's a perceptual experience, even after somebody is told that this red-looking drink is actually flavored orange, even after they know about it consciously, they'll take a sip and say, no, I still taste cherry. Okay, I know that you're telling me that this is actually flavored with an orange flavoring, but to me, it's still cherry, suggesting that it's not, something that they're kind of, wishy-washy on. It is a strong perceptual effect. They kind of can't get rid of the effect even if they know how it was created. It's a perceptual effect in that sense. What's going on neurophysiologically? Neurophysiologically, some very interesting things are happening. We do know there's overlapping cell groups that are involved with tasting and seeing food. So in the parts of our brain that are going to be active when we taste something, it's actually going to activate parts of that tasting brain that overlap with cells that are also sensitive to seeing color and to seeing things like texture and that sort of stuff. So there are a lot of overlapping cell groups that are going to be sensitive to both of those components of a food, the tasting and the seeing of it, right? And these are what respond when we see food. Okay, which is interesting. Let me just take a little sidestep here and say that might be one of the reasons that these food shows are so successful on TV. Because if you think about it, why should they be successful? Just kind of theoretically, why should seeing foods kind of be interesting to us? And it could be that when we see foods on TV that are filmed nicely and have a beautiful presentation, they're kind of inducing the cells that are responsible for taste to kind of become active. So we kind of are tasting things kind of vicariously, but in a kind of neurophysiologically based way. So then when Gordon says, now this is how a custard should taste, right? Or he says, this is a mess, one thing or the other, right? We're kind of vicariously experiencing that, and maybe in a fairly vivid way because of these overlapping cell groups that respond to seeing food. It kind of induces kind of this, I don't know, an idea of what the food probably tastes like, all right? Also, when you smell food, it actually, when you're smelling a food, it actually induces activity in the visual brain. It induces activity in the visual brain. And so what it's going to do is it's going to kind of mix together and influences what we kind of experience as the sight of a flavor. And so here's the big take home on this. It kind of is going to answer our question, should food taste better in the dark? And the answer is no. It's certainly no. In fact, our experience of how flavorful something is, our experience of what that flavor is dependent on what we're seeing. If we're not seeing our food, it's not going to have the same strength of flavoring. It's not going to have the same kind of intensity of flavor, which is exactly what my friends and I experienced when we went to that dark restaurant. Okay? Everything was bland, which is something actually, I guess, the research is telling us, right? Maybe the most, I guess, clear demonstration from that in the research is this one right here, okay? The intensity of taste depends on how bright something is. If something seems diluted, even if it's the same flavor components in it, it's going to seem less flavorful, okay? If things can't be seen in the bright colors they're meant to be presented with, things are going to be tasting less vivid. Same reason that people who lose their sight in an accident spontaneously say, this is awful, of course, I can't see anything, but I didn't think it would affect my sense of taste. People who are blindfolded say the exact same thing. What a food looks like has a very strong influence on what it tastes. Okay? Let's continue with this type discussion, and maybe that's not that surprising for those of you that are cooks or watch a lot of cooking shows when you think about it, because the presentation, the visible presentation, is such an important part of the food experience, of the tasting experience. But this might seem a little bit more surprising. It's not just what you see, it's what you hear that has an influence over our taste. And what I mean by that is when you are chewing food, the food sounds a certain way, and that sound influences how we experience its flavor. We judge crispness, we judge freshness on sound, and that can influence on how tasty something is. And interestingly, it doesn't actually even depend on you judging your own chewing. If you are sitting next to somebody who's eating a carrot, you can judge its freshness by listening to them. And actually, if you then chew on the carrot yourself and chew on the other piece, so that they break it off, you like carrots? Sure, have half of my carrot. And then you start chewing on it. It's from the same carrot. It's going to have an equal crispness to it, hopefully. You're going to have the same experience, whether you were listening to them chewing on it or yourself chewing on it, in terms of how you rate its freshness. Okay, so that's how important sound can be. Now let's talk about how sound gets in, how the sound of chewing gets into our ears. Okay, so let's talk about hearing food as we're chewing on it. As you're chewing, depending on whether you have your mouth closed or open, hopefully you're polite and you'll have your mouth closed, you get sound two ways. And this is also true of hearing in general. Most sound we get through the air. It comes in from outside sources and goes through the air and goes into our ears this way. But when we're talking about sounds that we ourselves are making, whether it's our own voice or our own chewing, we actually get sound from something called bone conduction. And so when you are listening to your voice, the sound does leave your mouth and comes through the air. Okay, it leaves your mouth, comes through the air and goes into your ears. But it also, because your voice is going to create vibrations inside your body, the vibrations are conducted by the bones. I guess when we're talking about the jaw, and then it goes up through the mandible and then through the skull. The bones are going to resonate with the sound of your own voice and go into your inner ear directly to affect what you hear. Okay. In fact, just as a kind of an aside here, you remember the first time you heard your voice on a recording? right? When either you were young, whether it was a recording on your phone or something like that, or in a video or something, it's like, oh my gosh, I never realized that my voice sounded so thin. It sounded so kind of, you know, brittly or you know, kind of, you know, less authoritative. I mean, when I listen to my voice on these things, I sound much less, you know, kind of professorial and, you know, I don't know, more whiny, more thin, that sort of thing. And that is because you do get the sound of your voice both through air, but also through bone conduction. The bone conduction makes it sound more resonant. And so you hear your voice more resonant than everybody else does. Okay. Other people only get air conduction through your voice. You get both bone and air, and the bone conduction makes your voice seem resonant. Let's go back to chewing. When you're chewing, there's a relative importance that changes between what you're doing as you chew. As you open your mouth, you're getting more air conduction. As you close your mouth and chew with your mouth closed, well, hopefully you get more bone conduction. So it kind of switches from air conduction to bone conduction, just so you know how you're hearing your own food. Okay, how are we doing here with time? We're okay. Let me talk now about this experiment that was done with potato chips, which I think is very, very clever. People put on, actually this guy, you can't see this. Oh yeah, by the way, I should say that in this experiment, what they wanted to do is they told people that they were going to be tasting different pieces of different brands of potato chip. So they were never given a whole potato chip, they were just given little pieces of potato chip. And in this experiment, the way they made sure that actually all the potato chips they were getting were exactly the same is they used a brand of potato chips where every chip is exactly the same, which is Pringles, right? You know this, that Pringles are Pringles everywhere in the world as long as they're not flavored, right? And they're the exact same kind of texture, and they have the same salt and all that sort of stuff. You know, they're synthetic chips, more or less, right? So they gave people little slivers of Pringles and asked them to rate them on the flavor and the crispness and things like that. And they put them in a sound booth. And they had them chew. First of all, they were wearing a blindfold, I should mention. That guy's not wearing a blindfold. He should have for the demonstration. They're wearing blindfolds. They're chewing on the potato chip. And there's a microphone that is basically taking the sound of their potato chip, putting it out to a computer, and then that computer is immediately returning the sound to headphones they're wearing. So they are listening through headphones to the sound of their own chewing. Okay? What that computer is doing is something very simple. It's going to be like turning up the treble or turning down the treble on your car stereo. It's actually like turning up the treble, turning down the bass, or turning up the bass and turning down the treble. And you know what that does to sound. If the treble is up, right? If the treble is up, it's going to sound, you know, kind of more detailed, kind of, you know, more live in a sense. If you turn down the treble and turn up the bass, it's going to sound muddled. And what they found was, depending on if they turned up the treble or turned up the bass and turned down the treble, people said the crispness was dependent on that. So if there were a lot of treble in the sounds they were hearing as they were chewing, they said it was crisp. If it was more muddy, the bass was turned up, they would say it was a less crisp potato chip, and it wasn't very fresh. So the louder, the brighter the sound. I guess they increased loudness in some of these experiments too. But the more treble, the brighter the sound, the crisper they said, the quieter or the duller the sound seemed as they were listening to it in headphones, the staler it was. And it wasn't just crisp and stale they were able to make these distinctions on. It was also how much they liked the potato chip. Brighter, louder, they liked it more. Duller, staler, they liked it less. Okay, I got to end there. We'll continue talking about this stuff and finish up our discussion of taste on Thursday. Have a good few days. We'll see you then.